At the end of 1812, the United States had learned a brutal lesson. The war it expected to win quickly had not bent to American confidence. Detroit had fallen. Fort Dearborn had become a frontier trauma. Queenston Heights had ended in defeat. Canada had not collapsed. Tecumseh's alliance with the British had helped transform the Western War into something far more dangerous than many Americans had imagined. Yet defeat did not end American ambition. It sharpened it. In Washington, President James Madison's administration understood that the first year could not become the pattern for the entire war. The Republic needed proof that it could recover. In Kentucky, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and the Territories, the call for revenge mixed with the practical need to regain lost ground. Detroit had to be retaken, the Great Lakes had to be controlled, the frontier had to be secured. Canada still tempted American planners, even after a year of failed invasions. The next phase of the war would be fought across water, forests, mud roads, forts, and native homelands. It would not be decided by one battlefield. It would be decided by whether armies could be supplied, whether fleets could be built from raw timber, whether militia could be held together, and whether native coalitions could survive the pressure of American recovery. The British and their allies also knew the stakes. Upper Canada had survived the first year, but survival did not equal safety. Isaac Brock was dead. British manpower remained limited. The Royal Navy ruled the Atlantic, but inland lakes were a different problem. On the Great Lakes, control had to be built locally, ship by ship, cannon by cannon, sailor by sailor. For Tecumseh, the meaning of 1813 was even sharper. Detroit had given his Confederacy momentum, but if the British could not hold the Lake Corridor and the Detroit frontier, the native barrier he hoped to build could begin to collapse. His alliance with Britain was powerful, but it also made his future depend on British commitment and British success. Far to the south, another crisis was gathering inside the Creek world. Tecumseh's message of resistance had traveled through the southeast before the war. But the Creek nation was not united behind one path. Some leaders worked with the United States. Others, remembered as Red Sticks, resisted American expansion, accommodation, and internal opponents. The result would become a civil war within the Creek world and a frontier war that drew in Andrew Jackson, U.S. militia, Cherokee allies, Choctaw allies, and terrified settlers. So Episode 2 begins with a nation trying to recover from humiliation, an empire trying to defend Canada, native leaders trying to preserve sovereignty, and two theaters of war beginning to connect: the Great Lakes and the southern frontier. In 1813, the war caught fire. The American recovery in the Northwest centered on William Henry Harrison. Harrison already knew the frontier war. As governor of Indiana Territory, he had negotiated land cessions, confronted Tecumseh, marched on Prophetstown, and fought at Tippecanoe. To many Western Americans, he was the natural leader to repair the disaster of Detroit. To many native people, he was one of the faces of the expansion they were fighting to stop. Harrison's new task was punishingly practical. He had to build an army in country that resisted armies. Roads were poor or non-existent. Wagons sank in mud, rivers froze, flooded, or blocked movement. Men enlisted and went home. Supplies disappeared into distance. Horses died. Food spoiled. Disease moved faster than orders. The Northwest Campaign was therefore not only a story of battles, it was a story of logistics. Detroit could not be recovered by anger alone. Harrison needed roads, depots, fortified posts, boats, pack animals, discipline, and time. Every mile toward the enemy required labor before glory. In January 1813, a forward American force under James Winchester moved toward the River Raisin, near Frenchtown in Michigan Territory. The movement was meant to support the recovery of Detroit, but it exposed the Americans before Harrison's larger system was ready. British forces and native warriors under Henry Proctor and native allies struck. The fighting at the River Raisin ended in American defeat. The aftermath became one of the war's most searing memories in Kentucky. Wounded prisoners were killed by some native warriors after the battle, despite attempts by others to restrain violence. News of the event traveled under the cry, "Remember the Raisin." That slogan mattered. It turned grief into fuel. In Kentucky, where many of the dead had come from, the River Raisin became a rallying wound. It deepened the emotional link between the war against Britain and the war against native resistance. It also hardened the desire for revenge, which would shape the campaign that followed. Harrison pulled his forces back into a defensive system and built Fort Meigs on the Maumee River in present-day Ohio. The fort was not glamorous. It was a large, muddy, timbered work meant to hold supplies, protect the line of advance, and anchor the American recovery. But in frontier war, such places mattered more than speeches. Proctor and Tecumseh came against Fort Meigs in the spring of 1813. British artillery opened fire. Native warriors surrounded the area. Inside the fort, Harrison's men endured bombardment, mud, fear, and confusion. Relief forces from Kentucky arrived, but part of that force made a disastrous attack on British batteries and was overwhelmed. Fort Meigs became a brutal lesson in discipline. Some Americans fought well, others rushed too far, too fast, and paid for it. The siege did not break Harrison's position, but it did show that Tecumseh and Proctor could still threaten the American line. For Tecumseh, Fort Meigs was also a political test. He needed British pressure to remain strong, but he was frustrated by what he saw as British caution. Tecumseh wanted decisive action. He knew that time favored the United States. Every month gave Americans another road, another fort, another ship, another wave of militia. A second attack came later at Fort Stephenson, where a young American officer, George Croghan, refused to abandon the post. British and native forces attacked, but the fort held. The defense became another boost to American morale. After Detroit and the River Raisin, Western Americans were desperate for proof that their forts could stand. By mid-1813, Harrison had not yet retaken Detroit, but he had done something essential. He had stopped the collapse. He had created a line from which recovery could begin. What he still needed was control of Lake Erie. Without the lake, supplies and armies moved slowly and dangerously. With the lake, Detroit could be approached, British positions could be isolated, and the Western War could turn. That meant the next decisive battlefield would not be a field at all. It would be water. While Harrison struggled in the Northwest, American leaders also looked toward Lake Ontario and the Niagara frontier. The logic was simple. If the United States could control Lake Ontario, threaten the St. Lawrence, and pressure Upper Canada from the east, British defense would become much harder. But as in 1812, simple maps produced complicated campaigns. In April 1813, American forces under Henry Dearborn and Naval Commander Isaac Chauncey attacked York, the capital of Upper Canada, present-day Toronto. York was not the strongest British military position, but it carried political value. Capturing it would show that the United States could strike into Canada after the failures of the first year. The landing succeeded. American troops pushed inland. British and Canadian defenders resisted, but could not hold the town. During the fighting, a powder magazine exploded, killing and wounding many Americans, including Brigadier General Zebulon Pike. Pike had been a prominent officer and explorer. His death gave the victory a bitter edge. York fell, but occupation turned ugly. Public buildings were burned, property was taken, and the episode left a memory in British Canada that would matter later. The Americans had won a raid, but they had not captured the heart of British power. They had not secured Kingston, the more important naval base. They had gained a symbolic victory while missing a strategic opportunity. The war on Lake Ontario became a contest of ships, ports, and caution. Chauncey and his British counterpart, James Yeo, maneuvered for advantage, but neither side easily destroyed the other. Control of the lake shifted in rhythm with shipbuilding, weather, and risk. A fleet that looked dominant in 1 month could become vulnerable when the enemy launched a new vessel. At the Niagara frontier, the United States followed York with an attack on Fort George in May 1813. This time the operation showed better coordination between Army and Navy. American troops landed under fire, British forces withdrew. Fort George fell, and for a moment it looked as though the American campaign might finally break into Upper Canada. But again, victory did not become decision. American forces advanced inland and collided with the limits that had haunted them before. Command confusion, supply problems, local resistance, and British counteraction. In June at Stony Creek, a British night attack threw the Americans into confusion. The battle was small, but its effect was large. 2 American generals were captured. The advance stalled. The momentum from Fort George faded. Later that month, at Beaver Dams, another American force moved against a British outpost and fell into disaster. Laura Secord, a Canadian civilian, famously warned British forces of the approaching Americans. Native warriors, including Mohawk and Caughnawaga fighters, played a crucial role in surrounding and pressuring the American column. The Americans surrendered. Beaver Dams showed again that native allies were not side notes in the war. Their presence, movement, and battlefield skill could decide outcomes. It also strengthened Canadian memory of resistance. Civilians, militia, British regulars, and native allies all contributing to defense against invasion. For the United States, the Niagara campaign became another frustration. Fort George had fallen, but the larger invasion faltered. York had been burned, but British Canada survived. Lake Ontario remained contested. The war seemed to offer victories that dissolved before they became strategic success. Still, the pressure mattered. Britain had to defend multiple fronts. American forces were learning, even through failure. And inland, on another lake, Oliver Hazard Perry was preparing the campaign that would change the Western War. Lake Erie was the hinge of the Northwest. Whoever controlled it could move men and supplies across water far faster than overland roads allowed. British control helped sustain Detroit and Proctor's position. American control could cut that lifeline, open the way for Harrison, and force the British and Tecumseh to retreat. But control of Lake Erie had to be built almost from nothing. At Presque Isle, Erie, Pennsylvania, American shipwrights worked under enormous pressure. Trees became frames, frames became hulls. Hulls became brigs and schooners. Cannons had to be dragged into place. Sailors had to be found. Supplies had to pass through weak infrastructure. British ships watched and threatened from the lake. Oliver Hazard Perry was young, intense, and determined. He had served at sea, but Lake Erie was not the Atlantic. It was shallow in places, difficult to enter, and strategically unforgiving. Perry needed ships, crews, guns, and a chance to get his vessels over the sandbar at Presque Isle before the British could destroy them. His squadron became a product of improvisation and urgency. The brigs Lawrence and Niagara would be central. Perry named Lawrence in honor of Captain James Lawrence, who had died after the fight between USS Chesapeake and HMS Shannon. Lawrence's dying words, remembered as "Don't give up the ship," became Perry's battle flag. The phrase was not just decoration, it was an instruction for a war that had already tested American endurance. British commander Robert Heriot Barclay faced his own difficulties. His squadron suffered from shortages, manpower problems, and supply strain. The British position at Amherstburg depended on the lake. If Barclay could keep control, Proctor and Tecumseh could continue to hold the Detroit frontier. If he lost, everything behind him would begin to shake. On September 10, 1813, the two squadrons met near Put-in Bay. The Battle of Lake Erie began with wind, distance, and positioning. Perry's flagship Lawrence took heavy punishment. British fire tore into her. Men fell, guns were disabled. The ship became a wreck of splintered wood, smoke, blood, and command pressure. For a time, the battle seemed to be slipping away. Perry refused to let it end there. With Lawrence shattered, he transferred by small boat through enemy fire to Niagara. The image became legendary, a commander crossing open water under danger, carrying the battle's hope from a dying ship to one still capable of action. Once aboard Niagara, Perry drove into the British line and turned the fight. By the end, the entire British squadron had surrendered. Perry sent Harrison the message that entered American memory: "We have met the enemy and they are ours." It was brief, almost spare, but it carried the weight of a year of humiliation. Detroit could now be answered. The lake was American. The road back into Michigan was open. The victory mattered beyond morale. It broke the British supply position in the West. Proctor and Tecumseh could not remain where they were without control of the lake. Amherstburg and Detroit became vulnerable. The alliance that had seemed so powerful in 1812 now faced a hard truth. Ships built in Pennsylvania had changed the land war. For Harrison, Perry's victory was the signal to move. For Tecumseh, it was the beginning of a crisis. After Lake Erie, the British position in the Detroit frontier unraveled. Proctor abandoned Detroit and Amherstburg and retreated eastward into Upper Canada. Tecumseh was furious. To him, retreat threatened everything. Native families and warriors had committed themselves to the alliance with Britain because they believed it might halt American expansion. If British commanders abandoned ground whenever pressure mounted, what would become of the native barrier? Tecumseh reportedly demanded that Proctor stand and fight. His argument was strategic and moral. The land was not an abstraction. It was home, hunting ground, diplomatic space, and future. Retreat meant exposing native communities to American return. It meant that the victory at Detroit might become a memory instead of a foundation. Harrison pursued with American forces, supported by Perry's control of Lake Erie. The campaign moved through roads, rivers, and settlements shaped by exhaustion. British regulars, Canadian militia, native warriors, and families moved under pressure. Supplies were short, confidence weakened. On October 5, 1813, the retreat ended near the Thames River at Moraviantown. The battle was swift and decisive. Harrison's mounted Kentucky troops charged. British resistance broke quickly. Proctor's line collapsed, and he fled. Tecumseh and his warriors continued fighting in the wooded ground. There, Tecumseh was killed. His death changed the war. It did not end native resistance, and it did not erase the many native leaders and communities still fighting for their own futures. But Tecumseh had been the most visible architect of a broad confederacy against American expansion in the Old Northwest. He had offered a political vision larger than one village or one treaty. He had argued that native land could not be sold piece by piece, that division was the path to dispossession, and that unity was the only possible answer to the scale of American pressure. At the Thames, that vision suffered a terrible blow. American memory turned the battle into revenge for Detroit and the River Raisin. Harrison's reputation soared. Kentucky fighters found the vindication they had wanted. The Northwest frontier seemed redeemed. Detroit was back in American hands. British power in the region had been badly damaged, but triumph had a darker meaning. With Tecumseh dead and British forces pushed back, the possibility of a British-supported native buffer state in the Old Northwest weakened dramatically. The United States had not simply won a battle. It had removed one of the greatest obstacles to future expansion. Proctor's conduct damaged British trust with native allies. Many native people had already suspected that British promises were limited by British priorities. The Thames deepened that suspicion. Britain needed native allies, but the Empire's central war was still against Napoleon. Native survival was not the same as British strategy. Harrison became a national figure. Perry became a hero. Tecumseh became a legend, admired even by enemies for courage, eloquence, and vision. But legends do not restore armies. They do not rebuild confederacies by themselves. The Western War had turned. Yet even as Tecumseh fell in the north, the southern frontier was exploding into violence of its own. The Creek War cannot be understood as a simple footnote to the War of 1812. It was connected to the larger war, but it was also its own crisis. A civil conflict within the Creek Nation, a struggle over accommodation and resistance, a frontier war involving the United States, and a devastating chapter in the history of native sovereignty in the Southeast. Creek society was diverse and politically complex. Towns did not always move together. Some leaders worked to maintain relations with U.S. officials. Others believed accommodation had become surrender by another name. Trade, debt, land pressure, roads, missionary influence, and American demands all created internal strain. Tecumseh had traveled south before the war, urging resistance and unity. His message did not create every division, but it added force to existing tensions. Among those who resisted accommodation, the Red Sticks emerged as a militant movement, committed to defending Creek autonomy and restoring older ways of life. Their opponents included other Creeks who feared that militant resistance would bring disaster. The conflict escalated in 1813. At Burnt Corn Creek in July, Mississippi Territory militia attacked a Red Stick party returning from Pensacola, where they had obtained supplies. The fighting was confused and inconclusive, but its effect was explosive. Retaliation became more likely. Fear spread among settlers and among Creeks aligned against the Red Sticks. Fort Mims became the center of that fear. The fort, located north of Mobile, held settlers, militia, enslaved people, and mixed Creek families who had taken shelter behind its stockade. Warnings came that danger was near, but preparation was incomplete. On August 30th, 1813, Red Stick warriors attacked. The assault was catastrophic. Hundreds inside the fort were killed. Some were taken captive. The event shocked the region and became one of the most powerful rallying cries of the southern frontier. Like the River Raisin in Kentucky, Fort Mims became a wound turned into policy. But the story was not only settler fear. Fort Mims also showed the depth of division inside Creek society. Many victims had Creek ties. The violence fell inside a world of kinship, faction, and civil conflict, as well as along the line between Native and American communities. The United States responded with overwhelming force. State militias mobilized. Tennessee sent Andrew Jackson. Georgia and Mississippi Territory forces moved. Cherokee and Choctaw warriors allied with the United States, in part because their own interests and rivalries led them against the Red Sticks. Creek opponents of the Red Sticks also joined the campaign. Andrew Jackson was not yet the national hero of New Orleans. In 1813, he was a hard-driving militia commander dealing with supply shortages, mutiny threats, hunger, political disputes, and a war that stretched his fragile army. He could be relentless with enemies and with his own men. He believed discipline had to be forced if necessary. Jackson's campaign moved through the Creek country with violence and hardship. At Tallushatchee in November 1813, American forces under John Coffee destroyed a Red Stick town. At Talladega, Jackson relieved friendly Creeks besieged by Red Sticks. These battles were part of a widening war in which villages, food supplies, alliances, and terror all mattered. The Southern War became a mirror of the Northern one in several ways. Native resistance was divided by internal politics. The United States used Native allies against Native opponents. American victory would open more land. Frontier trauma gave political energy to campaigns of retaliation. By early 1814, the Red Sticks had fallen back toward a fortified bend in the Tallapoosa River. The place was called Tohopeka by the Creeks. Americans would remember it as Horseshoe Bend. Horseshoe Bend was a natural fortress. The Tallapoosa River curved around the land in a great loop, creating a peninsula protected on three sides by water. Across the narrow neck of land, the Red Sticks built a strong barricade of logs. Behind it were warriors, families, and the desperate hope that this position could stop Jackson's advance. Menawa, one of the Red Stick leaders, prepared to resist. The defenders knew the stakes. Defeat would mean more than losing a camp. It could mean the breaking of the Red Stick military movement and the reshaping of the Creek world under American power. Jackson approached with U.S. regulars, Tennessee militia, and Native allies including Cherokee, Choctaw, and Creek fighters opposed to the Red Sticks. His army had suffered shortages and discipline problems, but by March 1814, he had enough force to strike. On March 27, 1814, Jackson attacked. Artillery fired into the barricade, but did not simply erase it. American troops eventually stormed the works in a direct assault. Meanwhile, Cherokee and other Native allies crossed the river, attacked from the rear, and set fire to parts of the Red Stick village. The defenders were trapped between the barricade and the river. The battle was devastating. Red Stick casualties were enormous. Menawa survived, badly wounded, but the military power concentrated at Horseshoe Bend was broken. American losses were far smaller, though still real. Among the wounded was a young Sam Houston, fighting under Jackson, long before his own later fame in Texas. Horseshoe Bend effectively ended the main Creek War. But victory did not bring justice. In August 1814, the Treaty of Fort Jackson forced the Creeks to cede an immense amount of land, including land from Creek groups that had fought alongside the United States. Jackson demanded land as security, punishment, and strategic prize. The result opened much of present-day Alabama and parts of Georgia to American expansion. This is why Horseshoe Bend belongs inside the larger story of the War of 1812 and the Indian Wars. It was not just a battle against one faction. It became a turning point in the transfer of land and power in the Southeast. The pattern was familiar. Native allies helped the United States defeat Native enemies, only to find that American expansion did not stop at the line between friend and foe. The logic of security became the logic of dispossession. Jackson emerged from the campaign with a reputation for resolve. That reputation would carry him toward command at New Orleans and eventually toward the presidency. But for the Creek people, the cost was catastrophic. Towns were destroyed. Political balance was shattered. Land was taken on a scale that reshaped the region. In the north, Tecumseh's death had weakened the dream of a native barrier in the Old Northwest. In the south, Horseshoe Bend broke the Red Stick military challenge and opened a new chapter of American expansion. By 1814, the war against Britain was still unfinished. But for many native peoples, some of the most decisive losses had already happened. The campaigns of 1813 and early 1814 transformed the War of 1812. The United States had entered 1813 embarrassed and angry. By the time the campaigns of Lake Erie, the Thames, and Horseshoe Bend had unfolded, the country had recovered much of its confidence. Detroit had been retaken. British power in the western Great Lakes had been pushed back. Perry had given the nation one of its cleanest victories. Harrison had become the general who answered 1812's humiliation. Jackson had crushed the Red Stick stronghold in the southeast. But recovery came with consequences. The death of Tecumseh was one of the war's great turning points. His Confederacy had been the most serious effort to unite native nations across the Old Northwest against American expansion. Without him, resistance continued, but the political center of that movement was badly damaged. British promises of a native buffer would become harder to fulfill and easier to abandon. The Creek War revealed another hard truth. Native communities were not united by a single strategy, and the United States could exploit those divisions. Some native leaders fought with Americans to protect their own towns and futures. Yet American victory still produced land loss on a massive scale. Alliance with the United States did not guarantee safety from American demands. The British, meanwhile, had learned that North America could not be defended by assumption. Canada had survived repeated invasions, but the loss on Lake Erie and the death of Tecumseh weakened the Western position. Still, Britain was not finished. Napoleon's position in Europe was beginning to change. If Britain could eventually send more troops across the Atlantic, the war might enter a more dangerous phase for the United States. That phase was coming. The next chapter would bring larger British offensives, deeper blockades, attacks along the Chesapeake, the burning of Washington, the defense of Baltimore, the battles along the Niagara, and the approach to New Orleans. The war that began with American invasion would soon become a war of American defense. Episode 2 ends at a turning point. The United States had stumbled badly in 1812, but in 1813 it learned how to fight back on the lakes and frontiers. Perry's ships changed the map. Harrison's pursuit ended with Tecumseh dead. Jackson's campaign broke the Red Stick stand at Horseshoe Bend. These victories helped save American pride. They also accelerated American expansion. That is the hard center of this story. The War of 1812 was a contest between the United States and Britain, but it was also a set of wars over native land, sovereignty, and survival. On the Great Lakes and in the Creek Country, the future was not decided only by flags. It was decided by roads, forts, villages, shipyards, alliances, and the terrible cost of defeat. By 1814, the United States had regained momentum. Britain was preparing to strike harder, and the war was about to move from the frontier into the capital itself. By the spring of 1814, the war changed shape again. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon abdicated for the first time in April. Britain had spent more than a decade fighting France with nearly every nerve of imperial power. Now, for the first time since the War of 1812 began, London could look toward North America with more attention, more veterans, more ships, and more confidence. That did not mean Britain suddenly wanted an endless American war. British leaders were exhausted by years of European conflict. They had trade interests to protect and a public tired of taxes and military strain. But they also saw a chance to punish the United States, defend Canada, and enter peace negotiations from a position of strength. For the United States, this was dangerous timing. The country had recovered momentum in 1813. Perry had won Lake Erie. Harrison had retaken Detroit. Tecumseh had fallen at the Thames. Andrew Jackson had crushed the Red Stick stand at Horseshoe Bend. But recovery was not victory. Canada still stood. The Royal Navy still tightened the Atlantic blockade. The American treasury struggled. New England opposition to the war grew louder, and now British pressure was about to become heavier. The war narrowed into three great pressure zones. On the Niagara frontier, the United States would try one more time to prove that its army had matured. The old failures of 1812 could not be repeated forever. A better trained American force would cross into Canada and fight some of the hardest battles of the war. In the Chesapeake, British commanders would turn raiding into shock. The same coastline that had seen fear and disruption would now see a campaign aimed at humiliating the American government itself. In the north, along Lake Champlain, Britain would attempt a major invasion from Canada. If that invasion succeeded, British negotiators at Ghent could demand territory, strategic concessions, and perhaps even a native buffer in the Old Northwest. Native nations watched these movements with grim clarity. Tecumseh was dead, but the causes he fought for had not disappeared. In the southeast, the Treaty of Fort Jackson had just torn millions of acres from the Creek world, including land claimed by communities that had fought beside the United States. In the Old Northwest, many native leaders still hoped Britain might insist on a protected native homeland at the peace table. But hope depended on British battlefield leverage. If Britain won in 1814, the peace might be different. If Britain failed, native allies could be left exposed to the same American expansion they had spent years resisting. The war was no longer young. It had become a test of endurance, memory, and bargaining power. Every burned town, every captured fort, every naval victory, every retreat would travel to the diplomats at Ghent. In 1814, battles would become arguments, and the first argument would be made on the Niagara frontier. The American army that crossed the Niagara River in 1814 was not the same army that had stumbled through the first year of the war. It was still imperfect. It still depended on fragile supply lines, political patience, and officers learning under pressure. But under commanders like Jacob Brown and Winfield Scott, parts of the army had become more disciplined, more drilled, and more professional. Scott in particular pushed regulars through hard training until they could maneuver under fire with the steadiness expected of European troops. That mattered because Niagara had become a proving ground. The United States had invaded Canada before and failed to turn landings into lasting success. In 1814, the army needed more than courage. It needed control. The campaign opened with the capture of Fort Erie in early July. It was a clean beginning, but the true test came almost immediately at Chippawa on July 5, 1814. British commander Phineas Reel expected American militia. What he encountered instead was Scott's trained brigade, advancing with discipline across open ground. The battle became one of the moments when British regulars had to recognize that American regulars could stand and fight in formal battle. The Americans won at Chippawa, and the victory carried symbolic power far beyond the number of casualties. For a republic that had spent 2 years being mocked for failed invasions, Chippawa mattered. It suggested that the United States Army could learn, but Niagara did not give easy rewards. 3 weeks later, on July 25th, the armies collided again near Lundy's Lane, close to Niagara Falls. The battle began late in the day and continued into darkness. Smoke, musket flashes, cannon fire, shouted orders, wounded horses, and confused formations turned the field into a nightmarish contest for a ridge and its guns. Lundy's Lane was one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Winfield Scott was severely wounded. British and Canadian forces fought with stubborn endurance. American forces captured guns but struggled to hold the field. Officers fell or were captured. Units became tangled in the dark. Neither side won a clean strategic victory, but both paid heavily enough to remember the ground. The Americans eventually withdrew toward Fort Erie. There, the campaign became a siege. British forces attacked Fort Erie in August, hoping to crush the American foothold. The assault failed at terrible cost. Explosions, close fighting, and confusion ripped through the night. The defenders held, and the British suffered heavily. Later, American sorties added to the violence, but neither side could turn Niagara into the decisive breakthrough planners wanted. By autumn, the Americans abandoned and destroyed Fort Erie, then withdrew. On paper, the campaign had not conquered Canada, but it changed reputations. Chippawa, Lundy's Lane, and Fort Erie showed that the United States could field soldiers capable of meeting British regulars in brutal combat. For Britain, Canada had survived again. For the United States, the army had found a harder kind of respect. For native nations, the result was more troubling. If Britain could defend Canada but not force a decisive settlement, would it spend diplomatic capital defending native land south of the Great Lakes? The answer would depend partly on what happened elsewhere. And elsewhere, British ships were already moving through the Chesapeake. The Chesapeake had been vulnerable from the beginning of the war. Its rivers reached deep into the American interior. Its plantations, towns, shipyards, and roads were exposed to naval power. British ships could appear where American defenses were thin, land raiding parties, burn supplies, seize livestock, destroy public property, and vanish before militia could concentrate. By 1814, British commanders turned that vulnerability into a campaign of pressure. Admiral Alexander Cochrane directed operations in the region. Rear Admiral George Cockburn had already become infamous along the Chesapeake for raids that frightened civilians and embarrassed American authorities. Major General Robert Ross brought disciplined troops who had served in the European War. Together, British naval mobility and veteran infantry created a threat the United States struggled to meet. The British had several aims. They wanted to divert American forces, punish the United States for actions in Canada, disrupt war-making capacity, and damage American morale. They also encouraged enslaved people to flee to British lines. Some joined British service, including the Corps of Colonial Marines, while many sought freedom by reaching British protection. For enslaved families, the war could become a dangerous opening in a system built to trap them. American officials understood the danger, but preparation was uneven. The capital region was politically important, yet militarily exposed. Militias gathered, but many lacked training. Command arrangements were confused. Secretary of War John Armstrong underestimated the likelihood that Washington itself would be attacked, assuming Baltimore was the more obvious prize. In August 1814, British forces landed at Benedict, Maryland, and began moving inland. Their march placed Washington and Baltimore under threat. President Madison, cabinet officials, militia commanders, regulars, sailors, and civilians all tried to respond as the crisis unfolded faster than confidence. The decisive approach came at Bladensburg on August 24th. American forces formed to block the road to Washington. Some fought bravely, including naval gun crews under Joshua Barney, whose men served their artillery with determination. But the broader defense cracked. British rockets and disciplined infantry pressure unnerved militia formations. Units broke and fled. The collapse became so notorious that it entered memory as the Bladensburg races. The road to Washington opened. Inside the capital, panic spread. Government papers were gathered, officials fled. Dolly Madison famously arranged for the removal of George Washington's portrait from the executive mansion before leaving. The image endured because it captured the symbolic stakes of the moment. The young republic's capital was about to fall, and its memory of founding had to be carried out before flames arrived. By evening, British troops entered Washington. The United States had won victories in the West, but now its capital stood exposed before an enemy column. The war had reached the doors of government. Washington was not occupied like a conquered imperial capital. The British raid was brief, targeted, and symbolic. That did not make it less shocking. British troops set fire to public buildings, including the Capitol, the Executive Mansion, and government offices. Flames rose through a city that was still unfinished, scattered and young, but politically enormous in meaning. The Republic had declared war on the world's most powerful maritime empire. Now that empire had marched into its capital and burned the structures that represented national authority. The destruction carried several messages at once. It punished the United States for the burning of public buildings in Upper Canada, especially the memory of York. It demonstrated British reach. It humiliated Madison's administration. It warned Americans that distance from the Atlantic did not equal safety. Civilians watched the glow with fear, anger, and disbelief. Some British officers tried to limit destruction to public property, but war does not arrive as a clean instrument. The emotional effect spread far beyond the buildings themselves. If Washington could burn, what else could happen? Then weather intervened. A violent storm swept through the city, bringing heavy rain and fierce winds. Later memory gave the storm an almost providential character, as if nature itself had answered the flames. In practical terms, it helped end the fires and disrupted the British force. Ross and Cockburn did not intend to hold Washington. After completing the raid, they withdrew. Militarily, the burning of Washington did not destroy the United States. The government survived. Madison continued. The war went on. Politically, it was a humiliation that demanded an answer. That answer would come at Baltimore. Baltimore was not merely another city. It was a major port, a center of privateering, and a symbol of American defiance at sea. British officials considered it a nest of privateers whose ships had preyed on British commerce. If Washington was the symbolic heart, Baltimore was a fighting harbor. The city prepared seriously. Earthworks strengthened approaches. Militia gathered. Fort McHenry guarded the harbor. Citizens understood what had happened in Washington and knew that they might be next. The British came north from the Chesapeake expecting another blow, but Baltimore would not be Bladensburg. The defense of Baltimore began on land. On September 12, 1814, British troops advanced toward the city and met American defenders at North Point. The fighting was sharp and costly. Early in the action, Major General Robert Ross was mortally wounded, a major blow to British command. American forces eventually fell back toward the city's main defenses, but they had delayed the British advance and bloodied the attack. Baltimore's defenders had something Washington lacked: prepared positions, clearer local resolve, and the fresh memory of what failure could mean. The British Army hesitated before the defenses east of the city. A direct assault would be dangerous without naval support. That made Fort McHenry the key. On September 13th, British ships opened a long bombardment of the fort. Mortar shells and rockets arced through the night. Inside Fort McHenry, American defenders under Major George Armistead endured the fire. The British hoped to force the fort's surrender or open the harbor for attack. But the fort held. Francis Scott Key, an American lawyer who had gone under a flag of truce to help secure a prisoner's release, watched the bombardment from a British vessel. Through the night, the question was whether the fort had surrendered. At dawn, the great garrison flag still flew. Key wrote the words that became the Star-Spangled Banner. The moment mattered because it reversed the emotional direction of the Chesapeake campaign. Washington had burned. Baltimore endured. The British had shown they could strike the capital, but they had not broken American will. Instead, Baltimore became a story of resistance. The British withdrew from the attack. In the larger war, Baltimore did not win Canada. It did not end the blockade. It did not solve American financial problems or political divisions. But morale matters in wartime, and symbols can travel faster than armies. The sight of the flag over Fort McHenry offered Americans a counter-image to the flames of Washington. It also affected negotiations indirectly. Britain could threaten the coast and win raids, but could it force the United States into humiliating terms? That depended on whether British armies could win decisive ground. The next chance came far to the north, where a British invasion moved toward Lake Champlain. If one battle in 1814 did the most to shape the peace, it may have been Plattsburgh. The British plan was ambitious. Governor-General George Prevost led a large force south from Canada toward Plattsburgh, New York. With Napoleon temporarily defeated, Britain could send veteran troops across the Atlantic. A successful invasion down the Lake Champlain corridor could threaten New York, strengthen Britain's hand at Ghent, and perhaps force the United States to accept harsh terms. But land power depended on lake power. On Lake Champlain, American naval commander Thomas McDonough prepared carefully. He anchored his squadron in Plattsburgh Bay, choosing a position that forced the British to fight on terms he understood. McDonough's preparations included anchors and lines that allowed his ships to pivot, bringing fresh broadsides to bear when one side had been damaged. British naval commander George Downie brought his squadron into action on September 11, 1814. The battle was fierce. Cannon smoke rolled across the water, masts cracked, men fought guns on decks slippery with blood and splinters. Downie was killed early. McDonough's flagship Saratoga took punishment, but his anchoring plan allowed him to rotate the ship and unleash an undamaged side. The British squadron was defeated. Without control of the lake, Prevost's army could not safely continue. He retreated back into Canada. British officers criticized the withdrawal, and Prevost's reputation suffered badly. For the United States, the victory was enormous. Plattsburgh mattered because it denied Britain the leverage it needed. At Ghent, British negotiators had explored demands that could have reshaped the post-war frontier, including ideas connected to a native buffer state. But battlefield reality narrowed what diplomacy could sustain. The British had burned Washington but failed at Baltimore. They had fought hard on the Niagara frontier but had not conquered decisive ground. At Plattsburgh, their major northern invasion collapsed. That made status quo peace more likely. For native allies of Britain, this was devastating. A native buffer depended on British willingness and British leverage. If Britain could not force the United States to accept it, the demand would fade. Native nations had fought for survival. Diplomacy would soon show how little imperial alliance guaranteed. By late 1814, the war was moving toward its final act. Peace talks continued in Europe. New England Federalists gathered in anger at Hartford. In the South, Andrew Jackson moved toward New Orleans, where a British expedition would test the Mississippi Gateway after the Treaty of Ghent had already been signed, but before news arrived. The War of 1812 had become a strange thing, a conflict where the most famous American victory would come after peace was made, and where many of the deepest consequences would fall on native nations long after the cannon stopped. By the end of 1814, the War of 1812 had produced no simple winner. Britain had defended Canada, blockaded the coast, burned Washington, and shown the reach of imperial power. But it had not broken the United States, had not taken Baltimore, and had failed to turn Plattsburgh into a northern triumph. The United States had failed to conquer Canada, suffered humiliation at the capital, and endured economic strain and political division. But it had recovered from the disasters of 1812, won Lake Erie, retaken Detroit, broken the British Allied western position at the Thames, crushed the Red Stick resistance at Horseshoe Bend, fought respectably on the Niagara frontier, held Baltimore, and stopped the Lake Champlain invasion. In Washington, the burning of public buildings became a wound and a warning. In Baltimore, the flag over Fort McHenry became a promise. On the Niagara frontier, soldiers who had once been dismissed as amateurs had forced British regulars into some of the hardest fighting of the war. At Plattsburgh, naval preparation and battlefield geography had changed the diplomatic future. Yet for native nations, the pattern was darker. Tecumseh was gone. The Creek land cessions after Horseshoe Bend revealed how victory beside the United States could still end in dispossession. British diplomats, facing limited leverage and larger imperial priorities, moved away from insisting on a native buffer state. The peace that approached would restore boundaries between the United States and Britain, but it would not restore native power lost in battle, treaty, and abandonment. That is why 1814 cannot be remembered only as Washington burning or Baltimore holding. It was also the year when the diplomatic possibilities for native sovereignty narrowed sharply. The war between states was moving toward a draw. The struggle over land inside the continent was not. The next episode will carry the story into its final turn. The Treaty of Ghent, the Hartford Convention, the Battle of New Orleans, Andrew Jackson's rise, and the post-war consequences that pushed the story from the War of 1812 into the Long Age of Removal and the Seminole Wars. In 1813, the lakes caught fire. In 1814, the Empire struck back. And by the time the smoke cleared over Washington, Baltimore, Plattsburgh, and the Gulf Coast, the war was already becoming memory, myth, and unfinished business.